My husband stood at the nurse's station and said, "Don't call me unless she's dead." I was 3 feet behind him, still in my scrubs, blood still dried on my sleeve from the surgery I'd scrubbed out of the moment I got the call about my own mother. He didn't turn around. He was too busy laughing at a message on his phone, a message from someone who definitely wasn't me. What he didn't know was that the woman standing beside him at that station, the one he'd just waved off with a shrug, was Dr. Elena Reyes, chief of surgery, his wife. And in 6 minutes, she was about to hold his entire future in her hands. My name is Elena Reyes. I'm 41 years old, and for the last 9 years I've been chief of surgery at Riverside Memorial Hospital. Before that, I was a resident who survived on vending machine coffee and 4 hours of sleep, convinced that if I just worked hard enough, everything else in my life would somehow fall into place around it. I met Marcus during my 3rd year of residency. He was an insurance broker, 28 years old, the kind of confident that comes from never really being tested. We met at a friend's barbecue. He told me my scrubs were kind of hot, ironically, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked on a piece of watermelon. I laughed at that line for years afterward. I don't laugh at it anymore. We married 18 months later, in a small courthouse ceremony with 12 guests, because I was on call the weekend we'd originally planned our real wedding, and the hospital couldn't find coverage. Marcus told me it didn't matter. "As long as I get you," he said, "I don't need the show." I remember exactly how he looked when he said it, sincere, steady, like a man who meant every word. I believed him. I believed a lot of things back then. The first few years were good, or good enough. Marcus worked a stable 9-to-5 for a regional insurance firm, handling claims and liaising with hospital billing departments, a detail that would matter much more than I ever expected. I worked brutal hours, first as a senior resident, then as an attending, then eventually as chief of surgery. We didn't have children. We'd talked about it early on, then quietly stopped talking about it, the way couples do when a conversation becomes too uncomfortable to keep having. Somewhere around year 5, the comments started. "You care more about strangers on an operating table than you care about me," Marcus said once, after I missed his work dinner because a 16-year-old came in with a ruptured appendix. I remember standing in our kitchen at 11 at night, still in scrubs, listening to him say those words like they were a fact instead of an accusation. Marcus, someone's life was in danger. Someone's life is always in danger, Elena. That's your job. When is it ever going to be my turn? I didn't have an answer for that. Not one that satisfied him, anyway. So I did what I always did, I apologized, I promised to try harder, and I went back to work the next morning like nothing had happened. Looking back, I understand now that this was the pattern of our entire marriage. He would express disappointment. I would absorb it as guilt. We would move forward as if the conversation had resolved something, when really, nothing had been resolved at all. There were other moments too, smaller ones that I dismissed at the time but that stack up differently in memory now. The way he'd roll his eyes when a call came through during dinner. The way he introduced me at parties as my wife, the surgeon, in a tone that somehow made the word sound like an excuse rather than an achievement. The way he stopped asking about my cases, my patients, the things that used to make his eyes light up when we first met. I told myself he was just tired. Lonely. Adjusting to a marriage that didn't look like the one either of us had pictured as kids. I told myself a lot of things, because the alternative, admitting that the man I married had quietly stopped being proud of me, was too painful to sit with. Then, on a Tuesday in early October, my mother had a stroke. It was 4:47 in the morning when my phone rang. I saw the area code before I even saw the name, and something in my chest went cold before I'd even answered. "Dr. Reyes, this is St. Agnes Memorial. We have your mother, Carmen Reyes, in our ICU. She's presenting with signs of an acute ischemic stroke. We need you to authorize." I was already out of bed before the sentence finished. I threw on the closest clothes I could find, grabbed my keys, and shook Marcus awake. It's my mom, I said. She's had a stroke. I need you to come with me. He sat up, blinking, disoriented. Right now? Right now, Marcus. She's in the ICU. Okay, give me a minute, I'll follow in my car. I have an early call with a client tomorrow. I should probably drive myself so I can leave when I need to. I didn't argue. I didn't have the time or the energy to argue. I just nodded and left, already dialing the hospital back as I pulled out of the driveway. The drive to St. Agnes felt like it took both 4 minutes and 4 hours at once. I called Marcus twice on the way, once to update him on what the on-call neurologist had told me, once just because I needed to hear a voice that wasn't a stranger's. He didn't pick up either time. By the time I arrived, my mother was already stabilized, though the attending neurologist warned me the next 24 hours would determine a great deal. I stood at her bedside in the same scrub top I'd worn during a 12-hour shift the day before, my hair still pulled back in a surgical cap I'd forgotten to take off, watching the machines track her heartbeat like it was the only thing keeping the entire world upright. I called Marcus a third time. No answer. A fourth time. Nothing. By the fifth call, I stopped trying. 2 hours later, exhausted, dehydrated, running on nothing but adrenaline and fear, I walked out to the family waiting area to get a coffee I didn't actually want, just to have something to hold on to. That's when I saw him. Marcus. Standing at the nurse's station near the ICU entrance. Phone in hand. Laughing. Not the tired laugh of a man who'd been up all night worrying. A real laugh, easy and unguarded, the kind reserved for something, or someone, that made him genuinely happy. I slowed down before he noticed me. I wanted to hear what he was saying before he realized I was standing there. Look, Marcus was telling the night charge nurse, waving his free hand dismissively, the other still gripping his phone against his chest like it held something precious. I've got an early call with a client tomorrow morning, and I really can't be woken up every hour for updates. Don't call me unless she's dead. I mean it. She. My mother. The woman who raised me alone after my father left, who worked 2 jobs so I could afford my first stethoscope, who used to sit up with me during finals week just so I wouldn't feel alone. He was talking about her the way someone complains about a delayed flight. I stood there for a moment, feeling something inside me go very quiet and very still, the way I imagine a patient must feel in the second right before anesthesia takes hold. The nurse behind the desk, Priya Nadaraj, a nurse I had trained myself 3 years earlier during her transition from the ER to the ICU, looked up mid-sentence and saw me standing there. Her face went pale in an instant. Dr. Reyes, she said carefully, her voice shifting into a tone I recognized immediately as the one we use with families in crisis. You're here. Marcus spun around so fast his phone nearly slipped out of his hand. For a fraction of a second, before he could compose himself, I caught a glimpse of the screen, a name I didn't recognize, a thread of messages with little red hearts scattered through it, nothing to do with hospitals or grief or my mother at all. Elena, he stammered, shoving the phone into his pocket. I didn't hear you come out, I was just telling them. I heard exactly what you were telling them, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. He tried, as he always did, to recover smoothly. I meant if it was serious, they should just call once, not every hour, I have work. Don't call unless she's dead, I repeated slowly, evenly. That's what you said, Marcus. Word for word. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Priya didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence, and the careful way she avoided my eyes, told me everything I hadn't let myself see in 9 years of marriage, that the staff around us had likely witnessed this version of Marcus long before I ever did. I want to tell you that I yelled. That I threw something, or cried, or made a scene worthy of the moment. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter, and in some ways, far more devastating. I simply looked at him, at his pale, guilty face, at the phone now buried in his pocket like evidence, and I felt something shift permanently inside me, the same feeling I imagine surgeons get when they realize, mid-operation, that the diagnosis was wrong all along, and the real problem is something far more serious than anyone anticipated. Who were you texting, Marcus? Nobody. A colleague. It's not what it looks like. It never is, I said. I walked past him without waiting for a response and went back to sit beside my mother's bed. I didn't confront him further that night. I didn't need to. Something far more important was already unfolding, something Marcus didn't know about yet. 6 minutes before I'd walked out to that waiting area, hospital administration had called me, not as a daughter waiting on news about her mother, but as chief of surgery, regarding an entirely separate matter. A formal complaint had been filed against a liaison employee working across 3 hospitals in our network, someone responsible for coordinating insurance authorizations and billing between hospital administration and outside firms. 3 separate nurses, at 2 different facilities, had reported concerns about inappropriate conduct, a married employee using hospital systems and hospital time to conduct a personal relationship with another staff member, and potentially misusing his access to expedite claims for personal benefit. The name on that complaint was Marcus Delgado. My husband. I hadn't put the pieces together in the moment I received that call. I'd been too consumed with fear about my mother to process it fully. But standing there, watching him scramble to hide his phone screen at 5 a.m. in an ICU waiting room, laughing at messages from someone who clearly wasn't a colleague, it clicked into place with a clarity that made my stomach turn. I didn't say anything to him that night. I let him sit in the waiting room, restless and increasingly anxious, while I stayed beside my mother until the sun came up and her vitals stabilized enough for the neurologist to give us a cautiously optimistic prognosis. It was 3 days later, once my mother had been moved out of the ICU and into a recovery ward, that I finally sat Marcus down at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd once told me I cared more about strangers than about him. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need you to tell me the truth, because I already know most of it. He went very still. Okay. Who is Sophia? His face drained of color. That was answer enough, but I waited anyway. It's not, Elena, it's complicated. It's really not, I said. Either you were seeing someone, or you weren't. Which is it? The silence stretched long enough that I almost stood up and walked away. Then, quietly, he said, it started about 8 months ago. She works in scheduling at Grantwood Medical. It wasn't supposed to turn into anything. But it did. Yes. I nodded slowly, absorbing the confirmation of something I think I'd already known for longer than I wanted to admit. And the complaint against you at work? The one about misusing hospital systems? His eyes widened. How do you know about that? Because I'm the one who received the call about it, Marcus. 6 minutes before I walked out and heard you tell a nurse not to call you unless my mother was dead. He put his head in his hands. For the first time in years, I watched my husband look genuinely afraid, not of losing me, I understood later, but of losing the version of his life where none of this ever came to light. I can explain everything, he said. I'm sure you can, I said. But I don't think I want to hear it anymore. The investigation moved faster than either of us expected. Hospital administration took the complaint seriously, especially once it became clear that Marcus's access to certain billing systems had potentially been used to expedite claims tied to Sophia's department, a conflict of interest serious enough to trigger a formal review board hearing. I recused myself from any involvement in the investigation, given the obvious conflict of my own marriage to the subject of the complaint. But I didn't need to be involved to know how it would end. Within 3 weeks, Marcus resigned from his position before the board could formally remove him. The insurance firm he'd worked with for 11 years quietly ended their contract shortly after. My mother, meanwhile, continued to improve. Slowly, with the kind of stubborn determination she'd passed down to me, she regained her speech, then her mobility on one side, then eventually enough independence to move back into her own apartment with home health visits 3 times a week. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed one afternoon, holding her hand while she worked through a physical therapy exercise, when she looked at me and said the words I'd needed to hear for longer than I realized. "I heard him," she said, her speech still slightly slowed from the stroke. "That night. I heard what he told them. I wasn't fully asleep." "Mom, you don't have to talk about that right now. You don't need a man who has to be told to show up, Mija," she said, gripping my hand a little tighter. "You've been showing up your whole life. For strangers on operating tables. For me. For everyone except yourself." I sat with that for a long time after she said it. I filed for divorce 2 weeks after that conversation. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no scene worthy of daytime television. Just a quiet meeting with a family attorney named Grace Whitfield, a woman in her late 50s with the kind of calm, unshakable presence I'd only ever seen in senior attending physicians during a code blue. "You've clearly thought this through," she said, reviewing the paperwork I'd brought. "I've had a lot of time to think," I said. "Do you want to know something I've learned in 28 years of family law?" she asked. I nodded. "The phone call didn't end your marriage," she said. "It revealed it." Those words stayed with me long after I left her office, echoing in a way that felt uncomfortably close to a diagnosis I'd been avoiding for years. Marcus didn't fight the divorce. I think, in some strange way, he understood that whatever damage had been done couldn't be undone with an apology, no matter how sincere. He signed the papers in a small conference room, his hand visibly shaking, and asked only one question before he left. "Is there anything I can do?" I thought about the 9 years, the missed dinners he'd resented me for, the phone calls he never answered, the hospital hallway where he'd dismissed my dying mother like an inconvenience on his calendar. "No," I said. "There isn't." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't argue. Word travels quietly in small professional circles, and ours was no exception. Priya, the nurse who had witnessed the moment at the nurses' station, later told me, gently, carefully, the way colleagues do when they're worried about overstepping, that several staff members at St. Agnes had quietly discussed what they'd seen that night long before I filed for divorce. "Nobody said anything to you directly," she admitted, "because it wasn't our place. But everyone noticed." I wasn't angry when she told me that. If anything, I felt a strange kind of relief, the confirmation that I hadn't imagined the pattern, that other people had seen the same thing I'd spent years explaining away. At Riverside Memorial, where I worked, the story eventually made its way through informal channels too, though I never spoke about it publicly. A few colleagues offered quiet words of support. One senior surgeon I deeply respected, Dr. Adebayo, stopped by my office one afternoon, leaned against the doorframe, and simply said, "Whatever you're carrying right now, you don't have to carry it alone here." I didn't cry in front of him. But I thought about it for a long time after he left. Marcus, for his part, seemed to disappear from our shared social circles entirely. Mutual friends mentioned, in the careful, indirect way people share uncomfortable updates, that he'd moved to another city, taken a smaller position at a different firm, and that Sophia was no longer part of the picture either. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The months that followed the divorce were quieter than I expected. Not easier, necessarily, but quieter in a way that let me hear my own thoughts again for the first time in years. I moved into a smaller house closer to the hospital, one with a garden I'd always wanted but never had time to plant. My mother, fully recovered from her stroke aside from a slight lingering weakness in her left hand, started coming over every Sunday for dinner, something we hadn't done consistently in years because my schedule, and Marcus's moods about my schedule, had always gotten in the way. I threw myself back into work, not as an escape this time, but because I genuinely loved what I did. I started mentoring younger residents more intentionally, the way senior surgeons had once mentored me. I remember standing over an operating table one afternoon, guiding a third-year resident through a complicated procedure, and feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit, pure, uncomplicated pride in my own work. I also started noticing things I'd stopped paying attention to during my marriage, small things, like how good it felt to make decisions without anticipating someone else's disappointment first, or how quiet a house could be without carrying the tension of a relationship slowly falling apart in the background. I won't pretend it was all peaceful. There were nights I sat in that quiet house and cried for the version of my marriage I thought I'd had, the one from the barbecue, the one who called my scrubs hot, ironically, the one who used to look proud instead of resentful. Grief doesn't disappear just because the reasons for staying disappear with it. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, our hospital held a community appreciation event honoring healthcare workers who had gone above and beyond during a particularly difficult flu season. Nothing extravagant, folding chairs in the hospital courtyard, a local high school choir, a few short speeches from the hospital administrator. My name was called among a handful of others for a small recognition. As I walked back to my seat afterward, an elderly man in a veteran's cap reached out and gently touched my sleeve. "Dr. Reyes?" "Yes, sir. My late wife was a nurse here for 31 years, he said. "She used to talk about doctors like you, the ones who show up even when nobody's watching." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "That means a lot." He nodded slowly, studying my face for a moment before adding, "She always used to say the strongest people are the ones who stay kind after life gives them every reason not to be." He paused. "I think she'd have liked you." I didn't know what to say to that. I simply thanked him again, and he tipped his cap and returned to his seat. But his words stayed with me for weeks afterward, echoing quietly every time I found myself doubting whether walking away from Marcus had been the right decision. People sometimes ask me, gently, carefully, whether I regret marrying Marcus at all. I understand why they ask. 9 years is a long time to invest in something that ended the way ours did. But here's the truth I've come to understand since that morning in the ICU waiting room: I don't regret loving someone. I regret believing, for far too long, that love meant tolerating being treated like an afterthought. I regret mistaking my own exhaustion for evidence that I wasn't doing enough, when really, I was doing more than enough for a marriage that had quietly stopped trying to meet me halfway. My mother recovered fully, aside from occasional stiffness in cold weather that she complains about every winter without fail. She still calls me every Sunday morning before I head to the hospital, just to check in, the same way she did when I was a resident surviving on vending machine coffee. I still work the same demanding hours. I still hold strangers' lives in my hands nearly every day. But now, when people ask who shows up for me during the hard nights, the answer has changed. I show up for myself first. Everyone else has to earn the rest. Sometimes, late at night after a long shift, I think back to that moment at the nurse's station, Marcus's voice, careless and dismissive, telling a stranger not to call him unless my mother was dead. At the time, it felt like the worst moment of my life. Now I understand it differently. It wasn't the worst moment. It was the moment everything finally became clear. Because sometimes the people closest to us reveal exactly who they are in the smallest, most careless comments, the ones they think no one important is around to hear. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to yell, or fight, or beg them to be someone different. It's simply to walk away, quietly, and build a life where no one ever gets to treat you like an afterthought again. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to walk away from someone who showed you exactly who they were, I hope you know you're not alone, and I hope, like me, you learn to show up for yourself first.